In a sealed pottery vessel buried in the cliffs above the Nile, the bones of a man waited for 4,500 years. He was not a pharaoh. He was not a noble. He was a potter, perhaps a craftsman of the Old Kingdom, laid to rest in a ceramic jar at the village of Nuwayrat. For nearly a century, his remains sat in a museum drawer in Liverpool, England, far from the river that shaped him. And then, in 2025, a team of geneticists did what no one had been able to do before. They read his entire genome. What they found did not match the story written on the walls of every Western textbook. It did not match the captions beneath the busts in the great European museums. It did not match the version of ancient Egypt taught for 200 years. It matched something older, something the record kept trying to bury. You are about to see how one man's DNA reopened a case that powerful institutions believed was closed forever. And the deeper question is not what the genome revealed. It is who decided, long ago, that this part of the story would be quietly removed. This is not an episode about pyramids. It is an episode about the people who built them, and about the men who, centuries later, decided who those people were allowed to be. Ancient Egypt is the most photographed, most studied, most replicated civilization in human history. Its monuments shape how the world imagines greatness itself. But for almost the entire modern era, a single question has hovered around it, never fully answered, often pushed aside in polite academic settings. Who exactly were the ancient Egyptians? The question sounds simple. The answer has been controlled. For 2 centuries, the most influential museums in the world organized their Egyptian collections around an unspoken assumption. Egypt was placed in galleries of the Near East. Egypt was framed as a Mediterranean civilization. Egypt was described as a bridge to Europe, a precursor to Greece, a sister to the great cultures of Mesopotamia. What was almost never said in the labels, in the catalogues, in the lecture halls, was the geographical fact that the civilization grew on African soil, along an African river, in unbroken contact with African peoples to the south. This is not a small omission. It is the architecture of how the world has been taught to remember Egypt, and it is the reason a single genome sequenced in 2025 has unsettled an entire field. The man from Nuwayrat lived between roughly 2855 and 2570 before the Common Era, in the early centuries of the Old Kingdom, the age when the Great Pyramid of Giza was being raised stone by stone. He was buried in the village cemetery in a way that was unusual for his time and place. His body was placed inside a large ceramic vessel, sealed, and set into a rock-cut tomb. That sealing is the reason his DNA survived. Egypt's climate is brutal to ancient genetic material. Heat destroys it. Time fractures it. Of the thousands of mummies and skeletons recovered from the Nile Valley, almost none have yielded full, readable genomes. The man from Nuwayrat did. His pottery coffin became, in effect, a time capsule. His bones were excavated in 1902 by the British archaeologist John Garstang, who was working at the site of Beni Hassan. Garstang shipped the remains to England, where they entered the collection of what is now World Museum Liverpool. They survived the bombing of the city during the Second World War, even after the museum itself was severely damaged. For more than 100 years, the man slept in a drawer. No one knew what he could tell us. No one asked. Then, a research team led by Adeline Morez-Jacobs, working with Pontus Skoglund at the Francis Crick Institute in London and with Linus Girdland Flink at the University of Aberdeen, decided to try. In July of 2025, their results were published in the journal Nature. It was, the team confirmed, the first complete ancient Egyptian genome ever sequenced. And the ancestry it described was not the one that had been quietly written into the museum labels. Approximately 80% of the man's ancestry traced to populations of North Africa. The remaining 20% traced to the eastern Fertile Crescent, the region that today includes parts of Iraq and Iran. There was no European component. There was no signal that linked him to the Mediterranean populations that later museums and later scholars often used to frame Egypt. He was, in the most literal genetic sense, an African man with an ancient Eastern connection, living in an African civilization, on an African river, 4,500 years before anyone in Europe had thought to write his story. A single genome cannot describe an entire civilization. The research team was careful to say so. The man from Nuwayrat is one person from one community in one century in a society that spanned 3,000 years, but his genome is not isolated. It joins a growing body of evidence, including earlier work on mummies from Abusir el-Melek, published in 2017 by a team led by Verena Schwennemann, that has slowly forced a question back into the open. If the ancient Egyptians were so deeply rooted in African ancestry, why was that ancestry treated for 2 centuries as something to be avoided in polite description? The answer is not in the bones. The answer is in the men who decided how the bones would be read. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to a small room in Göttingen, Germany, in the late 1700s. There, an anatomist named Johann Friedrich Blumenbach was building what he believed was a scientific classification of humanity. Blumenbach divided the human species into 5 categories, and he placed them in a hierarchy he considered natural. At the top, he placed a category he invented and named the Caucasian race, after a skull from the Caucasus Mountains that he found especially beautiful. Egypt presented him with a problem. Its monuments were too magnificent, in his view, to belong to a people he had categorized below the Caucasian. So Blumenbach made a decision. He examined a small number of mummy skulls and declared that the ancient Egyptians were, in essence, a Caucasian people who happened to live in Africa. The geography was incidental. The civilization was, in his framework, fundamentally separate from the continent that surrounded it. That decision, made in a single room by a single man in the late 1700s, became the foundation of how museums in Europe and the United States would organize Egypt for the next 200 years. It was not a conspiracy. It was something quieter and, in some ways, more powerful. It was a decision that flowed downstream into every catalogue, every gallery label, every introductory textbook, every illustration of an Egyptian king with European features, every dramatic film that cast Egypt in a Mediterranean light. And once it was in the system, removing it required confronting the men who had built the system. In 1844, an American physician named Samuel George Morton published a book called Crania Egyptiaca. Morton had assembled a large collection of ancient skulls. He measured them, he sorted them. He concluded in print that the ancient Egyptians were not African in any meaningful sense, but rather a branch of what he called the Caucasian family. His measurements were later shown to be deeply influenced by his assumptions, but by the time the criticism came, the conclusion was already inside the institutions. Morton's framing shaped the early American interpretation of Egypt. It shaped which artifacts were displayed next to which. It shaped which civilizations were grouped together in textbooks. Why did this version of the story take hold so completely? Why did it survive even after the measurements behind it were discredited? Who benefited when an African civilization was quietly reclassified as something else? Consider the period. The 1800s were the century of European colonial expansion into Africa. The same decades that produced the great Egyptological expeditions also produced the partition of the African continent at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. European powers were drawing borders across lands they did not own, justifying their presence with theories of civilizational hierarchy. In that context, the existence of a magnificent ancient African civilization, deeply rooted in African ancestry, sitting at the headwaters of Mediterranean culture itself, was not convenient. It complicated the story that was being told to justify the colonial project. It was easier and more useful to describe Egypt as an exception, as a civilization that happened to be located in Africa but was not of it. Until now, this looks like a series of academic mistakes, a misreading, a misunderstanding repeated for generations. But then the record changes, because the decision to separate Egypt from Africa was not made by accident. It was made by named men, in named institutions, with documented incentives, and it spread through the museum world with the precision of an editorial policy. In London, in 1882, the British government took military control of Egypt. In the decades that followed, vast quantities of Egyptian artifacts flowed into European collections. The British Museum's Egyptian galleries were expanded. The Louvre's holdings grew. The Berlin Museum acquired the bust of Nefertiti in 1912, removed from the excavation site at Amarna under conditions that Egypt has disputed ever since. Each of these institutions developed a curatorial vocabulary. Egyptian artifacts were placed in galleries labeled Ancient Near East. Egyptian kings were reconstructed with features that emphasized a Mediterranean appearance. Sub-Saharan African connections were minimized or omitted entirely. When Nubian artifacts were displayed, they were often presented as influenced by Egypt, rather than as part of a continuous cultural exchange in which Egypt itself was deeply embedded in African networks. The man who, more than any other, set the tone for British Egyptology in this period was Sir Flinders Petrie. Petrie was a brilliant excavator. He developed the techniques of stratigraphic dating that modern archaeology still uses. But Petrie was also a committed believer in what he called the dynastic race theory. He argued, in writings published from the 1890s onward, that the great achievements of early Egyptian civilization had been brought into the Nile Valley by an invading group of foreigners with superior abilities. The native population, in his framework, was the passive inheritor of a civilization that someone else had built. Petrie's theory has been thoroughly rejected by modern archaeology. There is no genetic, archaeological, or linguistic evidence of any such invading dynastic race. But for decades, his interpretation shaped how Egyptian origins were taught. This was the mechanism, not a single act of suppression. A long sequence of named decisions by named men, each adjusting the language slightly, each shifting the gallery slightly, each writing the next textbook slightly differently from the last. Blumenbach in Göttingen, Morton in Philadelphia, Petrie in London, curators in Berlin, translators in Paris, each one passing the framework forward, each one rarely questioning the room they had inherited. And the result, by the late 20th century, was an entire educational infrastructure in which the African foundation of Egyptian civilization had been quietly moved to the footnotes. Then the scientists began to ask the question directly. In 2017, the team led by Verena Schunemann at the University of Tübingen published the first large-scale ancient DNA study of Egyptian mummies. They examined remains from Abusir el-Melek, dating across roughly 1,300 years. Their results were complex and have been debated since publication. The mummies they sampled showed strong ancestral connections to the Near East and to North Africa, with what the team described as a relatively modest sub-Saharan component in that specific sample. The study was widely reported, and some headlines used it to suggest that ancient Egyptians were not African, but the researchers themselves were more careful. They noted that their sample came from a single site in northern Egypt, dating mostly to later periods, and that it could not represent the full diversity of Egyptian populations across 3,000 years and the entire length of the Nile. The man from Nuwayrat changed the picture. He was older than almost any of the Abusir el-Melek mummies, dating to the Old Kingdom rather than to the later periods sampled before. He came from Middle Egypt, not the northern delta. And his ancestry profile was significantly more African than the earlier samples had suggested. 80% North African, 20% Eastern Fertile Crescent, no European component. The team led by Adeline Morez Jacobs noted with appropriate caution that he is one person, but they also noted what his genome implies. The deeper into Egypt's past we look, the more African the ancestry signal becomes. This is the convergence the gatekeepers did not anticipate, because the genome of the man from Nuwayrat does not exist in isolation. It exists alongside the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in human history, carved into the walls of Old Kingdom tombs, in which the kings of Egypt describe themselves as rising from the southern lands. It exists alongside the Palermo stone, an ancient Egyptian record listing the earliest dynasties, in which the founding ruler, Narmer, who unified Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 before the Common Era, is depicted in art that consistently emphasizes his connection to the southern African source of the Nile. It exists alongside the Nubian pottery, the Nubian burial goods, the Nubian iconographic elements that archaeologists have documented at the earliest royal sites at Abydos and Hierakonpolis. It exists alongside the testimony of the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century before the Common Era and described the Egyptians, in his histories, as having dark skin and woolly hair, in language that has been variously translated and debated for 2,000 years, but which has never been comfortably accommodated by the museum framework that emerged in the 1800s. The ancient evidence and the modern evidence have begun to point in the same direction. The framework that sat between them, built by Blumenbach and Morton and Petrie and 1,000 quieter curators, is no longer the only available reading of the record. What survives in the genome of the man from Nuwayrat is not a claim. It is a measurement. 4,500 years after his death, sealed in his pottery coffin, his cells preserved a record that no editorial choice in any museum could overwrite. The record says he was, predominantly, a man of African ancestry, with deep roots in the populations of North Africa and an older connection to the Eastern Fertile Crescent that itself reflects the long history of human movement across that region. He lived in an Old Kingdom village. He worked, by the evidence of his bones, in a profession that involved long hours of physical labor, possibly as a potter. He was buried with care in a vessel sealed for the next world. And his body, by accident and by climate, and by the decisions of a British archaeologist who shipped him to Liverpool in 1902, survived to be read by a generation of scientists who had finally developed the tools to listen to him. The question is no longer whether ancient Egypt was African. The question is why it took so long for that ordinary geographical fact to be allowed back into the room. The answer, when you look closely, is not hidden in the bones. It is written into the catalogues, the gallery labels, the textbooks, the dynastic race theories, the skull measurements, the colonial era acquisitions, and the long, quiet authority of men who decided in rooms far from the Nile what an African civilization was permitted to look like. The man from Nuwayrat did not return to argue with them, he only returned to be read, and what his genome says, simply and without anger, is that he was always there. The story was always available. The evidence was always in the ground, and in the texts, and in the pottery, and in the southern monuments, and in the words of the people who lived along that river. What was missing was the institutional willingness to let the evidence describe itself instead of being described. This is the pattern the channel keeps finding, a truth that was never lost, a truth that was reshaped in transit, a truth that survives quietly in the materials until someone with the right tools and the right questions opens the drawer and lets it speak again. Ancient Egypt is not a special case. It is the most visible example of a much larger habit, in which the past is not simply preserved, but curated, and the curation reflects the priorities of the curators. The man in the pottery vessel is one voice. There will be others. As the genetic techniques improve, as more remains are sequenced, as more sites yield their data, the picture will become richer, more complex, more African in its early roots, more interconnected in its later periods, and more difficult to fit inside the categories that the 1800s left us. The pyramids will still stand. The hieroglyphs will still be read. The names of the pharaohs will still be spoken. But the frame around them, the quiet frame built by Blumenbach and Morton and Petrie, and the long museum tradition that followed them, is no longer the only frame available. The man from Nuwayrat has seen to that. Once you see this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. Subscribe to History Rewritten, because the past is not gone, it is edited.